Snow was falling heavily outside, blanketing the sky in white. I was cold. My mother held me and my younger brother tightly in her arms, her breath forming thin clouds in the air. I looked around. The darkness was all-consuming, with only the flickering headlights breaking through. A man approached, tall and silent. Dad spoke to him. His voice trembled. It didn't sound like him. "Are you Daniel?" "I am." "Are you Richard?" I didn't understand much. I just saw Dad nod, and the two of them moved to the front of the car. A flashlight beam swept across the engine. I couldn't see anything but cold, tangled wires and hear the wind whistling through the door cracks. "Mama?" my little brother whispered, burying his head in her chest. He wasn't crying, but I knew he was scared. I was scared too, but I gripped my mother's hand tightly, trying to stand still, like a grown-up. Then the man, Daniel, said something about towing the car. I caught words like garage and waiting room. Mom led my brother and me out of the car. The cold wind hit my face like blades. I tried to walk quickly so she wouldn't worry. Daniel was doing something to the car. I didn't understand, just saw him bending down, his hands moving non-stop. His gloves darkened with melted snow. They must have been freezing. But he didn't stop. The car was slowly towed away. Through the window, I saw a faint light ahead, a place that looked like a house. When we arrived, Daniel opened the door and turned on the heater. The room was old, but warm. I felt my hands start to regain feeling. Mom sat down on a chair, pulling my brother and me into her arms. My brother clutched his teddy bear. I looked around, a teapot, a few old books, a TV saying something about the weather. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was looking at Daniel. He was getting ready to leave, heading toward the garage. Mom stood up and gently touched his arm. "Thank you." From the bottom of my heart. I had never heard her speak to a stranger like that. Daniel only nodded. He didn't say anything, but I saw his eyes, like headlights in a snowy night. Not bright, not dazzling, but warm. And for the first time that cold, endless evening, I wasn't afraid anymore. The sky over Birmingham was shrouded in a thick, gray haze as the season's first snow fell silently onto the rusting tin roof of Hart's garage, an old repair shop tucked away on the outskirts of an industrial zone. Inside, flickering fluorescent lights cast a dull yellow hue over the space. Daniel Hart sat motionless behind an old wooden desk, his forehead resting in one hand, eyes heavy as he stared at a chaotic pile of invoices. Red ink numbers bled across the pages, crossed out and rewritten like scars etched into the last fragile remnants of his hope. Daniel had kept the garage running for nearly a decade, ever since his father, a gruff but honest Irish-born mechanic, had died suddenly of a heart attack. Hart's garage was more than a business. It was legacy, memory, blood, and bone. And now it was slowly crumbling under the weight of an era where electric vehicles reigned supreme and faith in technology had outpaced faith in people. Last month's customer count could be tallied on one hand: a faulty brake job, 2 oil changes, a truck in need of an electrical check. Far too little to keep the garage alive. Outside, wind whistled through the doorframe, lifting months of dust from the doorstep. Daniel pulled his wool collar tighter, his broad shoulders now seeming twice as heavy. Suddenly, the phone rang, jolting him back to the present. He glanced at the screen. Sophia, his youngest sister. "Big brother," her voice came through the speaker, warm like a cup of tea on a cold winter's day. "If you're planning to skip again tomorrow, the kids are ready to file a formal complaint." Daniel let out a quiet laugh, the first of the day. "I'm not skipping. I'll be there by 5. Save me a slice of the pumpkin pie, okay?" Sophia hesitated, then asked gently, "Are you all right? You sound tired." Daniel leaned back, eyes drifting toward the stained ceiling. "Just another long day. Same as always." She didn't push, only reminded him softly, "Be on time. They've been waiting for you for weeks now." After the call, Daniel stood up and stretched, joints cracking. He walked around the shop, flipping off switches and checking locks. By nearly 5 o'clock, the snow had thickened, cloaking everything in a blanket of white. He pulled on his old leather jacket, zipped it to his neck, stuffed gloves into his pockets, and headed toward the lot. Just as he slid the key into the ignition, his phone buzzed again. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hart's garage. This is Daniel." A woman's voice came through, panicked and trembling. "We're stuck on the M40, near exit 19. The car won't start. The temperature's dropping below freezing and the kids are in the car. I've called everywhere." You're the only one who picked up. Please. Daniel froze. The wind lashed at his face as if reminding him that time was slipping away. He checked his watch. For 52 p.m. images flashed in his mind, roast chicken, sweet pastries, the eager faces of his niece and nephew. But on the other end of the line, a child's muffled sob tore at his heart. What's your name? Elena Bennett. My husband's outside the car, Richard. We're trying to get the kids to see their grandmother. She's in the hospital. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaled. Keep them warm. I'm on my way. He turned back into the garage, grabbed his tow cables, toolbox, and emergency kit, then threw them into the truck bed. Before leaving, he called Sophia. I'm sorry. There's an emergency. A family's stuck in the snow. There are kids. I can't leave them out there. There was a pause on the line. Then Sophia's voice, calm and knowing, I figured you'd say that. Be careful, okay? If you're late, I'm saving you the biggest slice. Daniel didn't answer, just said thanks. The truck veered onto the highway, headlights cutting through the swirling white. He gripped the wheel tight, eyes scanning the road signs. In his mind, old memories of his father surfaced, nights spent fixing strangers' cars for free. Not everyone's lucky, his father used to say, but everyone deserves help at least once. 20 minutes later, he spotted flashing hazard lights by the roadside. A black SUV sat buried in snow, its windshield nearly frosted over. A tall, exhausted-looking man waved a flashlight. Daniel pulled over, switched on his hazards, and stepped into the biting cold. You Daniel? The man asked. I am. You must be Richard. The man nodded, hands trembling from the cold. Thank you for coming. I didn't know what else to do. Daniel crouched beside the engine, flashlight sweeping the compartment. The electrical system was completely dead, no chance of a quick fix. I'll have to tow it back to the shop. No way to repair it here. Your wife and kids can wait in the lounge. It's warmer. Richard nodded and waved Elena over. She emerged, clutching two children, a girl around 8 and a younger boy. Both were shivering, faces pale from the cold. The girl clung to her mother's hand, the boy rubbed his eyes, too cold to cry, staring at Daniel with fearful eyes. Daniel lowered the hook, secured the cables, checked each coupling carefully. His gloves were soaked with snow, the chill sinking deep into his bones. But he kept moving. He had to. Some things don't need a reason. Soon, the Bennett family's SUV was being towed back toward Hart's garage, the old shop now a glowing beacon in Birmingham's snowy gloom. Daniel opened the door, turned on the heater, and guided the family into the modest waiting room. Though worn and dated, it was warm enough to melt the cold. On the table sat a cooled teapot, a few old magazines, and a small TV still broadcasting the weather. Take a seat. I'll start on the car, Daniel said, glancing briefly at the boy now hugging a teddy bear tight to his chest. Elena grasped Daniel's hand before he turned to go. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. Daniel only nodded. He didn't say it's nothing or just doing my job. Because sometimes kindness doesn't need an explanation. He walked into the garage and shut the iron door behind him. The cold was still there, but inside, the fire that his father had kindled, the furnace of values, of compassion, still burned bright. Outside the garage, the snow was falling heavier by the minute. White flakes drifted silently, settling over the iron frames, the corrugated tin roof, and the black SUV still caked in salt and road dust. Inside, the garage lights reflected off the slick patches of oil on the floor, a light both cold and honest, much like Daniel's life at that moment, simple, scratched, but still burning. He crouched beside the engine bay, his hands flipping cables, tracing circuits. Years of instinct told him quickly what was wrong. The main control module had shorted, likely from water damage, compounded by an old battery that had nearly frozen solid in the sub-zero cold. Daniel clenched his jaw. This wasn't a half-hour fix. He'd have to dismantle much of the front electrical system, replace the starter unit, and patch a corroded cable, at least 3 hours' work, assuming nothing else failed. He didn't return to the waiting room to explain. He knew the weight of waiting, the sting of time slipping away. He knew the look in someone's eyes when all they needed was one more hour to say goodbye. He had stood in a hospital 5 years ago holding the hat his father had forgotten when the doctor told him his father hadn't made it. That was the one time in his life he had been too late. And he had sworn no one else would ever have to feel that. He worked without pause, fingers stiff and sore from cold and strain. Every so often he looked up through the fogged window toward the waiting room, still glowing with warm light. Elena sat between her children, warming her hands as she quietly told them stories. Richard had stepped outside to make a phone call, quiet, composed, but his gaze toward Daniel carried something unspoken, recognition, and perhaps respect. By 9 p.m. Daniel was done. The engine turned over. Headlights lit up. Everything was working for now. He wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag, shoulders aching as if weighed down by stone. When he stepped into the waiting room, the Bennett family stood up immediately. "The car's ready," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "I replaced the starter and temporarily repaired the circuit. You should stop by a garage near home to have the whole system checked." Richard nodded, his expression sober. Elena took her children's hands and bowed her head slightly. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." Daniel meant to nod and move on, but the little boy stepped forward, holding out a small chocolate bar wrapped in silver foil, the only thing he had in his coat pocket. "This is for you," he said shyly, his eyes shining in a moment of pure, innocent gratitude. Daniel accepted it not for its worth, but because it held a kind of thanks that words couldn't carry. Richard reached for his wallet, pulling out a stack of cash. "I'll pay. Whatever it costs." Daniel glanced down, then slowly shook his head. "Just the parts. Labor's free. Consider it a Thanksgiving gift." Elena exhaled softly and leaned into her husband. Her shoulders trembled slightly as though a weight had been lifted. Richard said nothing more. He simply reached into his coat and handed Daniel a business card with both hands. "If you ever need anything, call me. Anytime." Daniel gave a tired nod, not looking at the card right away. He was too worn out to care about a piece of paper with a name on it. When the Bennett family finally left, Daniel stood at the door, watching the SUV's taillights fade into the snowy dark. In that moment, he no longer felt cold. He returned to his desk, turned on the kettle, and reached into his pocket for a pen, only to feel something stiff. The business card. He pulled it out. The weak light caught on embossed letters. Richard Bennett, CEO, Bennett Automotive Group. Driving the future since 1989. Email, bennett@bennettmotors.uk. Daniel froze. That name, it wasn't unfamiliar. Bennett Automotive was one of the largest auto parts manufacturers and distributors in Europe. The silver-winged logo had been stamped on countless components he'd used over the years. Richard Bennett wasn't just another customer, he was one of the most influential figures in the automotive industry. Daniel sank into his chair, staring at the card, the image of a humble man, shivering in the snow, carrying his children, flashing in his mind. And himself, a no-name mechanic who hadn't asked, hadn't calculated, just did what was right. He let out a soft laugh, a strange blend of surprise and relief. He could have named a price. He could have played the hero. But he didn't. Because he never fixed cars for money. He fixed them because every car carried someone's story. And everyone deserved the chance to keep going. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. He slipped the card into his wallet, no expectations, no hopes. Just a memory. Like tucking away a small light in the long winter. And somewhere inside Daniel Hart, something stirred, like an old hinge easing open in silence. Not yet a miracle. But the beginning of one. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Birmingham entered the coldest stretch of the season. Snow-blanketed rooftops clung stubbornly to the windows of old cars parked along the roadside. Inside Hart's garage, the space heater hummed weakly, barely enough to drown out the growing emptiness swelling in Daniel Hart's chest. The workshop was silent. Now and then, a phone call would come in asking for an oil change or a brake check. But no one came. No one stayed. The invoices in the drawer were still there, like unmelted blocks of ice. Daniel had been up since 6, brewed a strong pot of tea, and began his usual routine, wiping down tools, checking the air compressor, reviewing backlogged bills. Not because anything was urgent, just because, if he sat still too long, the silence might become unbearable. The name Richard Bennett still echoed somewhere in the back of his mind, but Daniel didn't dwell on it. He wasn't the kind of man who waited for miracles. Maybe Richard really was a CEO. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he'd remember Daniel. Maybe he wouldn't. To Daniel, the business card had always felt like a polite thank you, and that was enough. Until the 4th morning. Everything was the same until the phone rang at 9:42 a.m. He picked up with his left hand, the right still holding a wrench midway through removing an oil filter. Hart's garage, Daniel speaking. Daniel Hart. The voice was unmistakable, clear, firm. This is Richard Bennett. Daniel straightened up as if someone had tugged his spine upright with invisible wire. Ah! Mr. Bennett. Is the car still running okay? Purring like a symphony came the deep, amused reply. But I'm not calling about the car. I'm in central Birmingham right now. Mind if I stop by? Daniel hesitated for a few seconds. He looked around the shop messy, cold, tired. Of course, he said. Doors open. 20 minutes later, an unfamiliar engine rumbled outside. Daniel glanced through the front window to see a black Bentley sedan pull up in front of the shop. Out stepped not only Richard Bennett but also two men in tailored suits, their presence clearly marking them as something more than average customers. The door opened. Richard entered first, the same easy smile on his face, but his eyes were more serious now. "Good to see you again," he said, shaking Daniel's hand with a firm, steady grip. "I brought a few people along. Hope you don't mind." Daniel wiped his hands on the rag by the bench. "As long as none of them brought an invoice." Richard laughed, then looked around. "I've done some digging into you, Daniel. About this shop. About how you've kept it going for nearly 10 years. Just trying to hold on to what my father left me," Daniel replied flatly. "Though I may be losing that fight." "Did you know," Richard said, pausing, meeting his gaze, "that there are hundreds of sleek, high-tech repair centers out there filled with the latest gear? But what they don't have anymore is trust. Customers are afraid of being cheated, of being treated like numbers. They don't know who to trust anymore." Daniel frowned. "That's not something I can change." "Not alone," Richard agreed. "But what if I told you I want to invest in this garage, not to turn it into something else, but to make it more of what it already is? To make it stronger, better equipped, more resilient. A place people can believe in." Daniel froze. He wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "You mean, buy it?" Richard shook his head firmly. "No. I don't want to buy it. I want to invest. I'll cover the entire cost of upgrades, new equipment, more staff, national-level facilities. But you stay in charge. You stay the owner. You stay the soul of this place. All I ask is that you keep doing what you did that snowy night for my family, the right thing." Silence settled over the garage like a heavy blanket. Daniel glanced at his workbench, still stained with dried oil from the week before. He looked toward the truck waiting for repairs, old, rusted, but someone's livelihood. Then he looked into Richard Bennett's eyes. There was no pity, no manipulation. Just one man genuinely offering to pull another man back from the edge. "Why me?" Daniel asked quietly. "Out of 100 garages?" "Because you didn't ask who I was before you helped me," Richard said, without missing a beat. "Because you fixed my car without naming a price. Because you treated a stranger like a regular. And because I want places like Hart's Garage to become the example in an industry that's forgotten what it means to have a soul." Daniel stared at him for a long moment. And then, for the first time in years, he smiled. Not the tired, polite smile he usually wore, but a true smile. The smile of a man who just saw a door open in a room he thought was sealed shut. "All right," he said, extending his hand. "If you keep your word, I'll keep mine." Richard shook his hand firmly, his smile deepening. "Then our partnership starts today." The rebirth of Hart's Garage began just a week after that fateful handshake. As if Richard Bennett had planned it all in advance, trucks carrying supplies, state-of-the-art equipment, and teams of technicians rolled in one after another, quickly filling the once empty and chilly lot surrounding the shop. Daniel stood there, hands in his pockets, watching men in uniforms bearing the Bennett Motors logo drill, measure, and assemble. He couldn't help but feel out of place in the very place that had once been entirely his. The garage, once filled with engine noise, hammering sounds, and the thick scent of oil, now echoed with safety boots, digital diagnostic machines, and technical jargon he had to Google to understand. The old brick walls were painted a sleek, pale blue. The rusted sign was taken down and replaced with a gleaming alloy frame bearing embossed letters. Hart's Garage, A. Bennett Motors Partner. It was beautiful, modern, impressive. But to Daniel, it didn't feel like home. He didn't say much for days. Just observed, quietly inspected every bolt, every beam, every piece of equipment as it was installed. One night, he stood alone in the middle of the shop under the bright new LED lights, their reflection gleaming off the polished tile floor, right where he had once scraped his knee bloody fixing a car at 18. Part of him was grateful. Opportunities like this don't come twice in a lifetime. But another part whispered doubt. Was he losing something? Was it still his garage if someone else rebuilt it? A week later, with the upgrades nearly complete, Richard Bennett returned, not in a suit, but in a gray canvas jacket and mud-stained leather shoes. He looked more like a farmer than the CEO of a billion-dollar company. He sat with Daniel in the old office, still untouched by renovations. The walls were stained with water damage. The floor bore a coffee spill from the previous month. "Notice anything strange over the past few days?" Richard asked, pouring 2 cups of tea from a thermos he'd brought along. Daniel accepted the cup, peering into the dark liquid. "Everything's been too fast, too clean, too perfect," he said slowly. "I'm used to spending a year saving up for a second-hand lift. Now they bring in 3 brand new ones before lunch. Sometimes I don't know whether to feel lucky or worried." Richard sipped his tea and nodded as if he had expected the answer. That feeling of losing control? It's natural. But you haven't lost anything, Daniel. This is still your garage. I didn't invest in you to change the way you work. I invested to make sure your way of working can survive in a world where decency is getting harder to afford. Daniel looked at him, and for the first time he realized Richard's eyes weren't like those of the men who had come in before with buyout offers. There was no calculation. No sales pitch. Just a quiet exhaustion from someone who had watched the industry he loved get chewed apart by profit margins. I just need one promise, Richard continued. Keep the same principles. Don't overcharge. Don't sell what doesn't need fixing. Don't lie. Whether rich or poor, when people walk through that door, they need to know they're stepping into a place where they're respected. Daniel set the cup down and leaned back, then nodded. I've never done otherwise. And I don't intend to start. The reopening was scheduled for early spring, 2 months later. In the meantime, Daniel rehired Owen, the old mechanic he'd had to let go when funds dried up. He also brought in Mason, a 20-something apprentice with bright eyes, clumsy hands, and a genuine respect for Daniel, the same kind of reverence Daniel had once shown his own father. Daniel personally hung a small sign in the corner of the office. White background, black letters. Nothing fancy. We don't sell services. We repair trust. It was his father's motto. Now it was the quiet declaration of the whole team. One evening near the end of the month, as the sun dipped behind the roof of the shop, Daniel stayed late to check the new control panel. Mason, still learning the diagnostic tools, walked over, hesitant. Boss, do you ever worry that with all these changes, our old customers might not come back? Daniel looked up. It was a question he'd asked himself more than once. He stood, brushed the dust from his sleeves, and walked to the desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a slightly crumpled sheet of paper, a child's drawing of a car, a smiling man, and large, scrawled letters that read, Mr. Daniel, the best fixer. He pinned the drawing on the corkboard, right beside the first handwritten invoice his father had ever given to a customer, 18 years ago. It doesn't matter what the shop looks like, Mason, he said. What matters is who crawls out from under the car, hands back the keys, and looks the customer in the eye to say, it's all fixed. And I didn't charge you for what wasn't broken. If you can do that, they'll always come back. Mason didn't respond. He just nodded and went back to organizing tools. Daniel watched him for a moment, then returned to the control panel. The light from the overhead lamps caught his face, a quiet smile forming there. Worn, but at peace. Outside, the snow had melted. Spring was coming. And Hart's garage, though dressed in a new coat of paint, still kept its old heart. That morning, the early spring sunlight filtered through the oaks lining Highway A41, casting streaks of light across the road leading to Hart's garage. The snow had melted completely, leaving glistening puddles on the dark asphalt, reflecting the rare clear skies over Birmingham. A brand new sign, mounted at dawn, stood silent yet commanding. Hart's Garage, A. Bennett Motors Partner. Below it, in smaller print, service with integrity. Since 1985. The garage that had once been mistaken for an abandoned warehouse now gleamed with glass and steel. The waiting room featured wood flooring, a coffee machine beside a small bookshelf, and a play corner for children. But deeper inside, where screwdrivers clinked, torches sparked, and diagnostic machines hummed, everything remained strangely familiar. There were no marketers, no supervisors. Just Daniel, Owen, Mason, and a quiet conviction: people build trust, not machines. The grand reopening began at 10 a.m. No red ribbon. No marching band. No flashy banners. Daniel had insisted it be simple, just like the way this place grew. Instead, there were familiar faces. Old Mr. Malcolm with his battered Land Rover, Mrs. Winifred, who once brought her son here for repairs and was now grandmother to 3. A sleek silver car pulled up to the curb. Richard Bennett stepped out, no security, no reporters. Just his usual calm grace, both formal and disarmingly warm. He shook every hand, missing no one. When he reached Daniel, he spoke softly. First day of a new chapter. And you're still wearing the oil-stained jacket from last year. Daniel smirked. Haven't had the chance to buy a new one? Or maybe, Richard replied, you're just not ready to take off the old one. Then he gave Daniel's shoulder a pat and gestured toward the small crowd. It was time. Daniel stepped onto a makeshift platform, 2 pallets and a sheet of plywood, no different from the one his father had stood on when the garage first opened in 1985. He looked out at the crowd, only about 30 people. But each face was familiar. Each nod carried a story. I'm not good at speaking in front of crowds, Daniel began, his voice low but steady. And I'm not used to events like this. My dad used to say, a good shop doesn't need a slogan, just let people leave feeling safe. I never imagined this place would have a polished sign. And I sure as hell never thought a CEO would invest in it because of a late-night call in the snow. A few soft chuckles rippled through the crowd. But I'm not standing here because of a miracle, Daniel continued. I'm here because of something simple, trust. We don't fix supercars. We don't promise to be the fastest or the cheapest. But we promise this. We'll always tell the truth. We won't charge for things that aren't broken. And we'll treat your car like someone we love is riding inside. He paused, eyes scanning the group, then stopped. Elena Bennett stood in the back row, her 2 children holding her hands. The boy, now wearing a baseball cap with a printed engine design, raised his hand and waved shyly. Daniel smiled. 3 months ago, he said, I helped a family stranded in the snow. I didn't know who they were. I just knew 2 kids were cold and their parents needed a chance to keep going. I didn't do it for a reward. But today, I understand sometimes a single kind act is the seed of an entire forest. A silence fell, brief, full, and then came the applause. Steady. Sincere. Not for show. After the ceremony, customers began bringing in their cars. A single dad with an old minivan. A university student with a 2006 hatchback. An elderly woman turned away from 3 other garages because her car was too old to fix. Daniel turned no one away. He ducked under cars, hands slick with oil, sleeves frayed. He chuckled with Mason while adjusting spark plugs and gave Owen a nod as they checked the suspension on a rusty pickup. By evening, as the sun dipped behind the roof of the shop, Daniel returned to the office. 2 letters were on his desk. One from the city council inviting him to speak at a forum titled Community Service and Rebuilding Trust in Small Business. The other from a high school student asking for an unpaid internship. Because I want to learn from you. Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply opened a drawer, pulled out an old drawing, a child's sketch of a car, a smiling man, and bold, uneven letters. Mr. Daniel, the best fixer. He carefully placed it between 2 panes of glass in a frame and mounted it on the wall, front and center. That drawing was no longer just a memory. It was a mission statement, not because he fixed cars better than anyone else, but because he had never once refused to fix the one thing that mattered most. Trust. Within just 6 weeks of the grand reopening, the name Hart's Garage began appearing in local media as something of a phenomenon. A modest repair shop once on the brink of closure, run by a middle-aged mechanic, now held up as a flagship center for the Bennett Motors Group. It sounded almost too perfect to be true. The first articles were glowing. The garage that rebuilt community trust. Hope restored through grease and kindness. But the more attention it attracted, the more curious eyes turned toward it. And soon, suspicion began to creep in. On social media, scattered comments appeared. Would he still be kind without Bennett Motors backing him? Smart PR stunt. Fix a few cars for free and get applause. Let's see how long he lasts when the flood of customers rolls in. Daniel wasn't on social media, but Mason was. And the young apprentice, despite his admiration for Daniel, accidentally let a few of those comments slip during a quiet afternoon at work. Daniel read them silently, then calmly folded the printout and placed it in the drawer. As more customers arrived, the same questions began repeating. Is the inspection really free? If I don't have money today, will you still fix it? Why is it half the price here? Is something wrong? Daniel always gave the same answer. We follow standard rates. No shortcuts, no made-up problems. And if you need to pay later, just be honest. But ironically, it was that very kindness that made some people uneasy. One middle-aged woman, after having her car repaired, returned and slipped 50 pounds into Daniel's hand. This is too cheap. It scares me. Daniel gently refused. Buy your granddaughter a cake with that, he said. I think she'll enjoy it more. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded and left. But Daniel knew she didn't fully believe him. And he didn't blame her. One morning in early May, Richard Bennett arrived unannounced. He sat down in the office, now renovated, with a new desk, warm lighting, and no more musty smell. But Daniel was still in his old scuffed leather chair. What's going on? Daniel asked, noting the weight in Richard's expression. I just came from a meeting with our media team, Richard began. They're saying you're distorting expectations. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? Some new branches were opened based on your model, Richard said. But none of them are like you. They can't be. They don't have you. He paused, choosing his words. And now when customers go there, they feel disappointed. The media's saying I made promises that can't scale. They're starting to ask if Hart's Garage is real or just a rare bright spot in a commercialized kindness campaign. Daniel leaned back in his chair. If they doubt me, tell them to come here. I'm not selling a story. I'm just fixing cars. Do you understand? Richard leaned forward. You've become a symbol. And symbols are always under scrutiny. Daniel was silent. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to be the last guy in the trade still keeping his word in an industry where promises were often the first thing sold off. So, you came to ask me to change? He said. No, Richard shook his head. I came to ask you this. If people start doubting, will you keep living the way you always have? Daniel didn't hesitate. I don't do this because someone's watching. I do it because I can't sleep if I don't. A faint smile crossed Richard's face, the kind worn by a man long tired of the industry he helped build. Then I'll keep standing behind you, he said, rising from his chair. But Daniel, be ready. Sometimes the best things must pass the hardest tests to prove they're real. 3 days later, a group of reporters showed up. No warning. No appointment. They wanted to do a documentary, The Truth About Hart's Garage. Daniel agreed. They filmed him speaking with customers. Filmed Owen repairing a truck. Filmed Mason patiently showing a young intern how to check spark plugs. After 2 hours, a young journalist approached Daniel quietly. Do you believe what you're doing here can spread across the whole industry? Daniel wiped his hands and replied. I don't need it to spread. I just need it to survive here. If it survives here, it'll spread on its own. That evening, Mason stayed behind. After some hesitation, he said, I see the doubt. I feel the pressure. But I also see people smile when they drive away. I see relief on their faces. And maybe that's enough. Daniel looked at him. A simple nod, the kind that said more than words. Then he pointed at the words now engraved in metal behind the reception desk, no longer chalk on a wall. We don't sell services. We repair trust. Doubt would come. Pressure would come. But the walls still stood. The lifts still worked. And Daniel Hart still wiped his hands on the same old cloth after every repair, smiled, and told each customer the same thing. Thanks for trusting me. Early summer sunlight poured across the front of Hart's garage, catching the silver sheen of the sign that now hung above the entrance. In the courtyard, a few customers waited with coffee in the newly furnished lounge. Children played with puzzles in a corner of the family area. Everything looked calm, orderly, professional, almost perfect. But inside the office, the air wasn't as light as the weather. Daniel sat in front of 2 copies of a thick contract, neatly bound, embossed with the Bennett Motors logo on the cover. He wasn't reading the legal terms. He hadn't turned a page. His eyes rested on a single section, marked in bold red ink. Partner centers are encouraged to adopt market-based pricing models, including consultation fees, bundled service packages, and utility support surcharges, if applicable. 3 lines. But those 3 lines held the entire issue. The meeting began at 9 a.m., held in the newly renovated office behind the garage. Present were Daniel, Richard Bennett, a Bennett Motors lawyer, and Helena, a finance representative with a voice sharp as glass and eyes that hid no ambition. This is a necessary step, Helena said evenly. The system must be consistent. If a customer pays half the price in Birmingham compared to our centers in Leeds or Bristol, what do you think happens? Daniel didn't blink. They'll think I'm not trying to drain their wallets. Helena frowned slightly. Richard sat beside her, hands clasped, silent and watchful. We're not asking you to be dishonest, Helena continued. Just align the strategy, offer packages, give the customers options. They can still choose individual services if they wish. At a higher price? Daniel countered. At a market-appropriate rate, she replied without pause. You'll still be able to support those in need. You'll still have authority to offer discounts. But the system needs a framework. And that starts here. She tapped the 3 lines in the contract. Richard sighed and turned to Daniel. I know this isn't easy, but if your model is going to expand, we need policy stability. Trust is the core, yes, but a business still has to operate in reality. Daniel leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the contract. Trust doesn't need a pricing table, he said. I don't offer premium interior detailing or seasonal AC inspection bundles. I don't sell what customers don't need. I ask one question when a car comes in. Do you want your vehicle safe to drive again? That's enough. Daniel, Richard said gently, you can be flexible. Cross it out. We're not forcing you. But they will. Daniel replied. When this model expands, when people start seeing profit in the name Hart's Garage, they'll put me in a spreadsheet. Each place will become a replica of something that's no longer me. Helena cut in, losing patience. You're holding back a national strategy over one line in the pricing model? Daniel stood, slowly, walking around the desk. He wasn't angry, just calm, like a man who knew he was the one holding the wheel in a storm. I'm not holding anything back, he said. I'm just refusing to let someone hang my sign and write their own numbers underneath it. Helena turned to Richard, as if expecting him to step in. Richard exhaled, then stood. He picked up the contract, opened the folder, pulled out a fountain pen, and drew a thick blue line through the offending clause. The ink pressed into the paper, bold, final, cold. I'll stand with you, Richard said, as long as you keep your promise. Daniel nodded, saying nothing more. But in his eyes, something had lifted, like a weight finally removed from his chest. That afternoon, after everyone had gone, Mason stepped quietly into the office, holding a mug of coffee. Heard the meeting got tense? Daniel smiled. Still got that marker? Mason blinked. What marker? The one you use to mark cut lines on exhaust pipes. The boy nodded and pulled it from his shirt pocket. Daniel took it, walked over to the sign mounted on the wall, the one with their familiar slogan. He added a new line beneath it in firm, deliberate strokes. No bundles, no upsells, no compromise. Mason read it aloud, slowly, then chuckled. I think some people are gonna hate us for that. Daniel turned back, smiling faintly. Then we're doing something right. Rumors travel faster than any car Daniel Hart has ever repaired. It started with a phone call from an unknown number, no voicemail. Then came an email from an assistant, informing him that a high-level government figure was planning an unofficial visit to Hart's Garage. Daniel thought it was a joke. But on Tuesday morning, right at 8 a.m., 3 black Range Rovers pulled smoothly into the lot, clean, precise, like a military formation. The door opened, and stepping out was none other than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Mr. Oliver Redford, flanked by advisors, aides, and a group of journalists held back across the street behind a hastily assembled police barricade. Daniel stood next to Mason and Owen, oil still on his hands, his mouth partway open, then shut again. You have an appointment? Daniel asked as the Prime Minister extended his hand. Redford let out a warm, booming laugh. His handshake was firm but not overbearing. No, but I heard your story from Richard Bennett, and I thought if we're going to talk about rebuilding trust in small business, there's no better place to start. Cameras clicked on. Lenses turned toward Daniel like curious and probing eyes. A BBC reporter whispered to her colleague, "That's the mechanic from Christmas Night. He's real." Daniel scratched his head. I'm not great with officials. If you want coffee, there's a machine in the lounge. If your car's broken, just leave the keys at the counter. Redford laughed again. I came to learn, not to inspect. The visit lasted over 2 hours. Daniel gave the Prime Minister a full tour. The lift bay, the diagnostic stations, the tidy parts room, all more organized now thanks to Bennett Motors' support. He explained each section plainly, without showmanship or nerves. Just the way his father used to share the craft. Redford listened carefully, asking exactly the right questions. But what struck Daniel most wasn't the questions. It was the man's eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had done real work, who knew what oil smelled like, who understood that some jobs don't need microphones to make a difference. Midway through the visit, the media was allowed closer. A young woman with short hair and an ITV badge stepped forward, mic in hand. Mr. Hart, you're now seen as a model for small business in the UK. How does it feel to receive attention at this level? Daniel blinked. He'd never had feelings about that kind of thing. But he spoke calmly. I just fix cars. And I try not to disappoint the people who hand over their keys and their trust. Don't you feel pressure? She asked. Daniel looked straight into the camera, a small, honest smile on his face. I don't feel pressure because people are watching. I only worry that one day, I'll look in the mirror and not recognize the mechanic I used to be. When the motorcade pulled away, Redford turned back and gripped Daniel's hand again. "You reminded me why I got into politics." Daniel smiled. "I just hope you remember that after you leave." Redford winked and climbed into his car. The cameras shut off. The shop returned to normal, or at least it looked that way. That night, Daniel turned on the TV for the first time in weeks. The news showed a clip of him standing beside the Prime Minister. Sweat on his brow, sleeves rolled high, still marked with a black oil smear. His words appeared as a subtitle beneath the headline. "I don't feel pressure because people are watching. I only worry that one day, I'll look in the mirror and not recognize the mechanic I used to be." Mason sat beside him, quietly. "I think you've created something bigger than a brand," he said. Daniel didn't reply. He simply stood, walked to the notice board, and pinned up a new photo. A snapshot of him with Redford with a handwritten caption underneath. "The more people watch, the more you have to stay true." He turned and looked out over the shop, where screwdrivers still clicked in rhythm, where Owen was pointing something out on an old machine, where Mason was practicing plugging in a diagnostic cable. Here, the lights were still the cold white of fluorescent tubes. There was no stage, no backdrop, only reality. And Daniel Hart, now a name known across the country, still wiped his hands on the same old rag, tucked it into his pocket, and walked over to greet the next customer waiting in line. The call came on a rainy morning, just as Daniel was replacing the brake pads on a 2004 Ford Fiesta for a single mother. The phone rang in his shirt pocket. He pulled it out, just as hot brake fluid dripped onto his wrist. The screen read, "UK Government Office." On the other end, a man introduced himself as the Prime Minister's Special Secretary, speaking in a voice so crisp it might have been recorded. He invited Daniel to join a newly formed National Advisory Council on Ethical Business and Consumer Trust. The first meeting would be held the following Friday in London, inside the Cabinet Office. First-class rail ticket and hotel already arranged. Daniel stood still for a few seconds. "You probably called the wrong guy," he replied, still holding the wrench. "I read invoices, not economic strategy." "No mistake, Mr. Hart," the man said. "We're looking for a real voice, not just one from a PR department." That week, the garage had a strange energy. Mason was excited. "You'll be sitting with ministers. Bet you'll be on the news again." Owen was more cautious. "Just be careful they don't turn you into a symbol and leave you there." Daniel said nothing. His mind hadn't settled. The night before his departure, he stayed late in the office, staring at the photo of his father on the wall. His dad, in an old mechanic's jacket, cigarette in hand, leaning on the Cortina he'd repaired 5 times. His face looked tired but unshakable. "Should I go, Dad?" Daniel whispered. No answer. Only rain on the tin roof. But Daniel knew. If his father were alive, he'd have said, "If no one from the trade speaks up, someone who doesn't understand the work will write the rules for us." Cabinet Office, London. 3rd floor. Conference Room 14. Daniel stepped into a walnut-paneled room with a long oval table, muted abstract paintings on the walls, and red velvet chairs. The others were already seated. A bank director, supermarket CEO, software developer, economics professor. Everyone had an assistant. Everyone had a laptop. And everyone looked at Daniel, the only one in a work shirt and worn safety boots. Not mockingly, but certainly with curiosity. A female coordinator introduced him. Daniel Hart, founder of Hart's Garage. An exemplar of service rooted in ethics and transparency. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel stood, no notes, no slides. His voice was calm and clear. "I don't have an MBA. I don't run a chain of 10 shops. I don't read quarterly reports in chart form. But I see customers every day. I look them in the eye when they ask, 'How much will it cost?' And I know they're not just asking about money. They're asking, 'Can I trust you?'" He looked around the room. Trust doesn't come from slogans. It comes from fixing something right one day and having the customer come back the next. And if I, a man who only knows how to hold a wrench, can do that, then anyone in this room can, if you're brave enough to say no to one more junk fee. Silence. No applause, but something shifted in the air. A balding man in a purple tie, representing a national garage chain, chuckled. "Mr. Hart, if we adopted your model, our profits could drop by half." Daniel nodded. "Maybe, but trust would double. And in the long run, that's worth more than any report." As the meeting ended, while others filtered out, a tall man in a gray overcoat and gold-rimmed glasses approached. His back was slightly hunched. "I'm Thomas Griggs, former Minister for Business and Trade." Daniel shook his hand. "The last time I heard someone talk about ethics in business without a PowerPoint was a decade ago," Griggs said with a smile. "Don't change, Hart. They'll try to mold you, but if you stay real, you'll make them rethink everything." Daniel just smiled. "It won't be easy," Griggs added, "but it'll be worth it." That evening, back in his hotel room, Daniel opened his suitcase and pulled out his mechanic's jacket. Then he sat quietly by the window. London glittered with city lights, but his mind was with the cold fluorescent bulbs of the garage, where Owen was changing oil, where Mason was learning to pull a gearbox. He didn't know if anything would change because of that meeting room. But he knew this. If someone had to stand between two worlds, one of grease and bolts, the other of documents and strategy, that person had to be real enough to be a bridge, not just a stepping stone. The next morning, Daniel caught the early train back to Birmingham. His work jacket was folded neatly in his backpack, ready to wear again. There was still work to do. Trust still needed repairing, one car, one person at a time. Monday, 7:36 a.m. The rain had just stopped. Daniel was crouched under the hood of a hatchback, checking the electrical system, when Mason ran into the garage, pale, holding a shaking phone. "Uncle Daniel," Mason swallowed, "you need to see this." He opened a video. On screen, a Renault van lay on its side by the road, rear wheel completely detached, its nose crumpled into a light pole. The headline below, "Serious accident near A34. Vehicle left Hart's garage 2 hours prior." Daniel said nothing. A chill crept down his spine. He immediately called Owen, who had serviced that van the day before. "That's Mr. McKinley's," Owen confirmed. "Electrician. I replaced the brake discs, checked the undercarriage. I didn't touch the rear wheels." But truth isn't required to become news. Within 3 hours, the headlines arrived. Flagship garage Harts involved in major accident. Cracks in the ethical brand? Once praised by government, Daniel Hart now faces allegations of negligence. Can trust be repaired when the one who built it might have broken it? A former schoolmate texted Mason, "You still working for that ethical guy? What's next?" Blame the weather. Daniel gave no interviews, published no responses, made no statements. He drove to the hospital where Mr. McKinley had been admitted. A broken arm, but thankfully no life-threatening injuries. When Daniel entered the room, the man looked at him. Not with anger, not with blame. "I'm not blaming you," Mr. McKinley said. "I know you're not careless, but the media doesn't care what's true." Daniel nodded, voice rough. "I'm rechecking every car in the shop, every bolt, every lift. If there's a mistake, I want to know before anyone else does." "You don't owe me an explanation," McKinley said. "You owe it to yourself. You live by your reputation." That night, Daniel gathered the entire team. Owen, Mason, the 3 new hires. No yelling, no speeches, just a plan. Pause all new repairs for 3 days. Offer free re-inspections of all vehicles serviced in the past week. Bring in a third-party safety auditor. Send a letter of apology, not as admission of guilt, but as a sign of accountability. "We don't respond with words," Daniel said. "We respond with work, with torque values that don't waver, with bolts that don't loosen, not even by one turn." 2 days later, Richard Bennett came by. No appointment, no coffee, no assistant. "You holding up?" he asked as he stepped into the office. Daniel nodded. "I'm not broken, just tightening everything back up." Richard sat down. "I'm being pushed to reconsider new branch expansions. Some investors are doubting this ethics-based model. They say one scratch is enough to shatter a mirror. Daniel leaned back. I never believed mirrors needed to be flawless. They just need to reflect the truth. Richard looked at him a long while, then gave a slight nod. If you want, I'll speak to the press. No, Daniel said. They don't need you. They need to see me, not hiding. 3 days after the accident, Daniel held the first public reinspection event in the industry. All previous customers were invited back. Each car was lifted, examined beneath their owner's eyes. An independent traffic safety agency was present, along with a group of mechanical engineering students, learning ethics and precision side by side. People lined up. Some came to find faults. Some came to see if the ethical garage still stood. And everyone saw, every car inspected as if it were the very first one. No shortcuts, no flair, just honesty. At noon, a middle-aged man in a wool coat approached Daniel as he wiped his hands. Mr. Hart, he said, I used to go to a chain shop. When my car failed, they blamed me. This time, I just want to say, thank you for not running. Daniel looked at him and nodded. I don't have anywhere else to go. This is my home. By day's end, the audit results were published. No fault found at Hart's garage. The wheel bolt had fractured due to pre-existing damage, unrelated to the recent service. The criticism faded. But Daniel knew trust, once cracked, can't be repaired with a certificate. That night, alone, Daniel opened the office cabinet. He pulled out his father's old notebook. On the first page, in blue ink, his father had once written, if a bolt loosens, the whole car loses control. If a man loosens his principles, the whole trade loses direction. Daniel turned the page. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, added after the inspection, was his reply. We're not perfect, but we don't get to be careless. He closed the notebook. Then, like every other morning, he prepared to open early. Because the work was still there. And trust still needed fixing. One car. One person. At a time. Monday, 7:36 a.m. The rain had just stopped. Daniel was hunched over the electrical system of an old hatchback when Mason burst into the garage, face pale, hands trembling with a phone. Uncle Daniel, he swallowed hard. I think you need to see this. Mason played a video. On screen was a Renault van lying sideways off the roadside, rear wheel detached, front end embedded in a lamppost. The headline below read, Serious accident near a 34 vehicle had just left Hart's garage 2 hours earlier. Daniel said nothing. A chill crept down his spine. He immediately called Owen, the technician who had inspected the van the day before. Owen confirmed that was Mr. McKinley's van, the electrician. I replaced the brake disc and checked the undercarriage yesterday. Didn't touch the rear wheels? But the truth doesn't need to be accurate to become news. Within 3 hours, headlines were everywhere. Model garage Hart's garage linked to major accident, the truth behind the ethical brand? Once praised by government, now Daniel Hart faces negligence allegations. Trust can be repaired, but who fixes it when its maker breaks it? One of Mason's old classmates texted, still working for that ethical guy? Blaming the weather now, huh? Daniel gave no interviews. No statements. No rebuttals. He drove to the hospital where Mr. McKinley was admitted. His right arm was broken, but thankfully he was stable. When Daniel walked into the hospital room, the man simply looked at him, no anger, no blame. I'm not holding you responsible, he said. I know you don't cut corners. But the media doesn't care what's true. Daniel nodded, voice rough. I'll have every car in the shop rechecked. From bolts to lifts. If there was any mistake. I want to know before anyone else does. You don't owe me an explanation, Daniel, McKinley replied. You owe it to yourself. Your reputation is your livelihood. That evening, Daniel gathered the entire team. Owen, Mason, and 3 new recruits. No shouting. No slammed fists. Just a plan. Stop accepting new vehicles for 3 days. Reinspect every car serviced that past week, free of charge. Invite an independent inspection agency to evaluate all procedures. Issue a public apology, not for guilt, but for accountability. We don't respond with words. We respond with work. With torque specs nailed to the decimal. With every bolt tightened to the last thread. On the second day after the accident, Richard Bennett arrived. No appointment. No assistant. No coffee. You all right? He asked, stepping into the office. Daniel nodded. Not broken. Just tightening everything again. Richard sat down. I'm being pressured to reconsider expansion. Some investors are doubting the ethics-based model. They say one scratch is enough to ruin the mirror. Daniel leaned back. I never believed mirrors had to be flawless. They just have to reflect the truth. Richard looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. If you need, I'll speak to the press. No, Daniel replied. They don't need you. They need to see me not hiding. 3 days later, Daniel held the first public vehicle inspection event in the industry. All past customers were invited back. Cars were lifted, opened, and checked directly in front of their owners. An independent road safety organization attended along with a group of engineering students, a live class in ethics and mechanics. People lined up. Some came looking for flaws. Some came to see if the ethical garage was still standing. But all witnessed the same thing. Every vehicle inspected with the care Daniel had on day one. No shortcuts. No polish. By noon, a middle-aged man in a wool coat approached Daniel as he wiped his hands. Mr. Hart, he said, I used to go to a chain garage, one of your competitors. When my car failed, they blamed me. Today, I just want to say thank you for not running. Daniel looked at him and nodded. I've got nowhere else to go. This is my home. That evening, the inspection report was released, no technical error from Hart's garage. The wheel bolt had failed due to a pre-existing fracture unrelated to recent work. Criticism faded. But Daniel knew once trust cracks, no certificate alone can seal it back. That night, alone in the office, Daniel opened an old drawer and took out his father's notebook, handwritten, worn. On the first page, his father had once penned in blue ink. If one bolt is loose, the whole car can lose control. If one person loosens their principles, the whole trade loses direction. Daniel turned the page. Below, in his own handwriting, added just after the inspection, was his response. We are not perfect, but we cannot afford to be careless. He closed the notebook, and as always, began preparing to open early the next day. The message arrived at 2:14 p.m. just as Daniel was refitting the engine cover on an old Peugeot belonging to Mrs. Winslow, a loyal customer since the first year he took over the garage. The message was brief, signed with a familiar set of initials. There's an international proposal. Call when you're free. RB. Daniel called Richard Bennett back at 5 p.m. after Mrs. Winslow's car had rolled out of the garage and Owen's cup of tea was still steaming. What makes you use the word international? Daniel asked bluntly. Singapore, Richard replied without pause. Their government is building a model urban service zone. One of the key pillars is transparent, friendly, and accountable service. Their Minister of Economy saw a documentary about you, and they want a replica of Hart's garage there. It would be the flagship center. Daniel paused for a few seconds. He imagined a garage just like his, the same familiar sign, but set in a city where people spoke languages he didn't understand, fixing cars he'd never touched before. And they want me to go there? Not necessarily, Richard said. They want your name, your model. You could send someone to train their team. They're even offering to license the name Hart's Garage as a certified brand. A brand. A trademark. Daniel leaned back in his chair, gazing at the ceiling of his office where a water stain from last year's storm still hadn't been painted over. 3 days later, he flew to Singapore at their invitation. All expenses were covered. Business class flights, 5-star hotel, interpreter waiting at the airport. Everything was arranged so perfectly there was no room left for doubt. He was taken on a tour of the planned district, a sleek complex of glass, steel, and technology. At the heart of it was a plot reserved for Hart's Garage Singapore, 3 times larger than his current shop. On paper, it included a reception hall, diagnostic bays, a technician training center. Everything up to spec. Complete. Flawless, even. The issue only arose at the end of the presentation when one of the coordinators handed him the franchise agreement. One clause was highlighted in bold. All operations must be adapted to local market conditions, including service pricing aligned with regional standards, seasonal cost adjustments, and promotional strategies as proposed by the investor. Daniel set the document down and folded his arms. Let me ask you this. If someone comes in needing a repair and I know they can't afford it, can I give them a discount or waive the fee? The coordinator smiled diplomatically. That would require formal approval. Here, fairness means consistency. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. Consistency isn't always the same as fairness. That night, he stood alone by the hotel window looking down at a city that never sleeps. Everything ran on time. Everything gleamed. Everything was accurate to the minute. But something was missing, the scratches, the scuffs, the oil stains. That smell somewhere between hot metal and human sweat. Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out something he always carried, a drawing from years ago by a little boy, Richard Bennett's son, with the scrawled caption, Mr. Daniel, the best fixer. He thought. The boy didn't call him best businessman. Not best brand. He called him fixer, someone who repairs. Not just cars, but trust. And trust can't be mass-produced or licensed. The next morning, Daniel sat across from the minister overseeing the project in a glass-walled boardroom. The young, well-dressed man waited for his final answer. You may keep the Hart's Garage name if the terms are agreed to, the minister said. And if successful, it will expand to 6 countries in 5 years. Daniel nodded. I'm honored. But I won't sign. A flicker of surprise. Are you certain? I can't allow a name built on trust to be cut from a template, he replied, standing, his voice steady but not raised. Because one day, somewhere across the world, someone might hang up a sign with my name on it and turn away a customer who can't pay. And that person won't say, a franchise turned me away. They'll say, Hart's Garage turned me away. Not a branch. Me. And I can't let that happen. The minister said nothing. Just nodded. No anger. Perhaps even a trace of respect. As Daniel boarded the plane back to the UK, he took one last look at the sleepless city fading behind him. He knew this opportunity wouldn't return. He knew some would call him foolish. And maybe his model would never go global. But as the plane lifted off, he felt something no airline could sell, peace. Because he had chosen not to betray the one thing that made Hart's Garage worth anything at all. Himself. June arrived early, bringing with it bright sunlight and the faint scent of honeysuckle drifting along the road to Hart's Garage. The weather was beautiful, customers were plenty, and the model of an ethical service garage remained a favorite subject of local newspapers. But amid the bustle, Daniel Hart, the man people called the one who fixes trust, was quietly falling apart inside. The message came at 3:08 p.m. while Daniel was reinstalling a new exhaust pipe on an old hatchback. His phone buzzed twice. He glanced at the screen. City Hospital, your mother is in critical condition. He dropped the tool without a word and ran straight to his truck. His mother, Evelyn Hart, had lived quietly ever since her husband passed. A slender woman with a gentle frame, her hands always carried the scent of black tea and peppermint oil. She had faithfully kept the books for her husband's garage for 20 years. She never interfered in the work, only asked one question when Daniel took over. Are you planning to do what's right? Daniel had nodded without hesitation. Now, sitting in the hospital room, watching her eyes closed, tubes everywhere, he wished more than anything he could nod one more time, one last time. The doctor said it was a stroke. Respiratory failure. Weak heart. Not much time left. Owen came to the hospital to take over the garage. Mason brought a handkerchief Mrs. Evelyn had once given him and gently slipped it into Daniel's jacket pocket. No one said much. They were simply there, the way Daniel had always been there for them. His mother passed away just before dawn in her sleep. No pain. No struggle. As if she had simply slipped her hand away from life. After the funeral, Daniel didn't return to the garage right away. He took 3 days off, the first time in nearly a decade that Hart's Garage opened without its owner. Owen worked quietly. Mason handled the front desk. The technicians split their shifts like always, but everyone noticed the chair on the left side of the office where Daniel's mother used to sit and read was now empty. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Daniel returned to the garage. He walked, not drove. Wore an old shirt. Unshaven. People saw him, started to speak, then stayed quiet. Just nodded respectfully. He nodded back, smiled faintly, and walked straight into the office. On the desk was his mother's ledger. Fabric cover, purple ink, neat handwriting. The last line she wrote 3 weeks ago was simple. Daniel hasn't changed. Thank God. He smiled softly, but his eyes stung. That night, Daniel stayed at the garage alone. He made a pot of black tea, the kind she used to drink, turned on the dim light, opened the ledger, and wrote a line beneath hers. I won't change either. I promise. The next morning, when the garage opened right on time, Daniel stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, smiling at the first customer, an elderly woman with a leaking car. He checked not only the mechanics but also the story. She lived alone. The money she had for repairs was meant for a new fridge that month. Daniel nodded gently. I think we can fix it without replacing the whole system. Just leave the car here. I'll drive you home this evening. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were slightly moist. Not from surprise, but because there was something in his voice, familiar. Like a mother's voice. That weekend, Daniel hung a new framed photo in the office. It was an old picture of his parents, taken in front of the garage in 1986, both of them smiling brightly. Beneath it was a small brass plaque, engraved with the words, "We didn't start this place to get rich. We started it so people wouldn't feel alone when their car broke down. Owen read it and quietly said, "Just like how you didn't let us feel alone when our hearts broke." Daniel smiled, gently squeezed Owen's shoulder. The two stood in silence. No more words were needed. When grief comes, people often ask, "How do you keep going?" Daniel didn't ask that. He simply chose not to stop. And every time he crawled under a car, the clinking sound of bolts echoed around him, engine smoke lightly clouded his vision. He felt like someone was still sitting in that empty chair on the left, still reading, still watching, still smiling. That summer, after all that had happened, the recovery, the spotlight, the doubts, the loss, Daniel Hart began to think about something that had never occurred to him before, the moment to step away. Not because he was tired, not because his faith had run dry, but because he understood kindness can't be tied forever to a single name. It must be relearned, redone, and passed on if it hopes to last longer than a single lifetime. So he began writing the first training program for Hart's Garage. The Responsible Mechanic, an 18-week course where students would not only learn to tighten bolts, but also how to look into a customer's eyes and listen to the story behind the engine noise. The first cohort had 7 people. 5 men, 2 women. All from different walks of life. A former inmate hoping to rebuild his life. A single mother who used to drive long-haul trucks. And a young Irish lad in his early 20s named Liam. Liam stood out. Naturally gifted. Quick learner. Meticulous. Respectful. Daniel saw in him a version of himself from 20 years ago, dark-skinned from the sun, quiet, but with eyes that always asked, "Is this the right way?" Everything was going smoothly until the 12th week. One morning, a major customer, a regional delivery company, called. A truck they just serviced at the garage was leaking oil in the middle of the road. Initial checks showed that a pipe hadn't been tightened to spec. Daniel went still. The work order showed Liam had handled that truck under the supervision of a senior technician. But according to the report, that technician had left Liam to finish the job alone. Daniel called Liam into the office. "Do you remember the truck?" he asked. Liam nodded, pale. I thought I checked everything." Daniel didn't yell. Didn't raise his voice. He placed the report in front of Liam along with photos of the leak and pointed to the last line. "Late detection, piston almost damaged." "I didn't mean to be careless," Liam said, his voice trembling. "I just didn't want to bother him for one last check. I thought I was good enough." Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked out the window. The sky over Birmingham that day was heavy, not raining, just gray. "You know about the broken bolt incident a few months ago, don't you?" he asked. Liam nodded. "Then you know it takes just one moment of pride to lose everything and sometimes make others lose even more." Liam lowered his head. "You think this program is just about fixing cars?" Daniel asked. "It's not. We teach humility here. Because a decent person isn't someone who never makes mistakes. It's someone brave enough to take responsibility when they do." Silence stretched between them. Then Liam looked up. "So, I'm being kicked out." Daniel shook his head. "No. But from today, you'll start again from week 1. Not because you're not capable, but because you need to remember, skills can be relearned. Character must be reforged." At the end of the course, all 7 graduated. They received certificates, not from the government, not signed by any CEO. Just a small plaque printed on thick paper with a single sentence. "We don't fix cars. We fix broken trust." Liam was hired as an apprentice technician. At the end of every shift, he wiped his hands clean, bowed slightly to each customer, and always kept a pen in his pocket, not to write invoices but to mark what he still had to learn. One evening, at the tail end of summer, Daniel sat in the office, watching the workshop. Mason was now lead technician. Owen coordinated everything. And Liam was hunched under a hybrid vehicle, learning how to diagnose via its digital dashboard. Daniel opened a drawer and took out a small wooden sign, the first one his father ever hung outside the shop, its hand-carved letters now faded. Hart's Garage, honest work for honest people. He dusted it off, wrapped it carefully in cloth, then stood, turned off the lights.